What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to my channel. We're gonna do something a little different today. With the release of the new SpongeBob SquarePants movie on the way out shortly, my plan was to review the first two movies as well and do a ranking of all three, and I still will be doing that. But I couldn't talk about any of these movies properly without at least first talking about the thing that started it all, the actual show, SpongeBob SquarePants. So that's what we're going to be doing today. So let me know in the comments what your thoughts on SpongeBob SquarePants were, how much of it you've seen, if you have a favorite episode, do you still watch it now? Let me know so we can discuss. Also, make sure to hit that thumbs up button if you like these reviews, as it helps me out immensely by getting my channel out there and growing the community. And if you are new here, I hope you consider hitting that subscribe button so you can stay up to date with reviews of new releases, older films, hidden gems, and so much more like TV reviews on a near daily basis. But let's not waste any more time and let's talk about SpongeBob SquarePants. This chronicles the nautical and often nonsensical adventures of SpongeBob, an incurably optimistic and earnest sea sponge, and his underwater friends. Whether searching for the ultimate spatula to perfect his burger flipping technique at the Krusty Krab, or just hanging out with his best friend Patrick, SpongeBob's good intentions and overzealous approach to life usually creates chaos in his underwater world. So there's going to be a caveat to this before we go any further. This review will only be of the classic episodes of SpongeBob, seasons 1 through 3. That was the original run with series creator Stephen Hillenburg as the showrunner, and he originally planned on ending it with the first movie. And when Nickelodeon decided to continue making new episodes, he stepped down. And with the very noticeable shift in quality, tone, and writing between the Hillenburg days and the post-Hillenburg days, they do feel like two distinctly different shows in my mind. So this is just going to cover the original run. If you want my review of everything post-Hillenburg, well, it's not that great, in my opinion. It's okay. That's my review of post-Hillenburg SpongeBob. There's not much I have to say on it, and I've only seen so many episodes. Anyway, that's not what we're here for, so let's talk about the classic episodes. I feel like there's only so much I can say regarding SpongeBob that hasn't been said already. I mean, not only is this show such a massive part of pop culture, but also of internet culture. Seriously, this was a show that was primed for the internet. It's inspired countless memes that are still used on a regular basis to this day, and a few of them are from the post-Hillenburg episodes, but many of them stemmed from these first 3 seasons.
Is mayonnaise an instrument?
No, Patrick, mayonnaise is not an instrument. Horseradish is not an instrument either.
It's a show that, if you especially grew up with it at the time, you'll come to realize is endlessly quotable. To this day, I'll still make references to this show in conversation with friends, and what's incredible is how they always stemmed from some of the most random moments. The show is so brilliant at having some of the most random, offhand lines be some of the moments that stood out the most to you.
We've been duped!
Duped!
Bamboozled!
We've been smeckledorfed!
That's not even a word, and I agree with you.
I remember being obsessed with this show growing up. Now, I wasn't always the biggest fan of Nickelodeon when I was younger. I mean, I watched it, but I had more of a love for Cartoon Network at the time, as well as Kids WB. Remember Kids WB?
WB yourself!
But while I like shows on Nickelodeon like Rugrats, Doug, and Hey Arnold, I absolutely loved SpongeBob. So much to the point that I started recording as many episodes as I could just so I can watch them whenever I wanted and not have to wait for a rerun. You know, since we didn't have streaming services then when they air the new episodes online the next day. Must be nice being able to actually grow up with stuff like that. And recently, I actually rewatched every single episode of those first 3 seasons before making this video, and I enjoyed most of them just as much now as I did back then. I still found all the same lines that I thought were funny then just as good now. I found newer appreciation for older jokes, and I was even able to pick up on a few newer jokes here and there. And it validates the thing that helped make SpongeBob such a massive cultural phenomenon at the time of its original release. And that's how it was such a great show for both children and adults. All audiences found the show equally as enjoyable, albeit for slightly different reasons. Kids can appreciate the show's wacky sight gags and physical humor, while adults can appreciate the off-kilter, random conversations all the characters have.
Don't you have to be stupid somewhere else?
Not until 4.
Now, the series had an interesting writing process. In an interview with one of the writing staff, it was explained that each episode didn't follow written scripts, but rather a 2-page outline was written, which would then be sent to a team of storyboard directors who produce a rough draft of the storyboard, and that's when the dialogue and the jokes were added. The visuals helped shape the story, rather than vice versa, and the process was compared to the early early days of animation. Hillenburg himself has even stated how the Looney Tunes were one of the direct inspirations for the show. And something I never did think about until I read that was, yeah, a lot of the gags here could be seen in something straight out of a Bugs Bunny or Daffy Duck cartoon.
No, please, have mercy!
Part of the series' visual humor was that it was known for its extensive use of stock footage and cutaways to brief live-action gags. Cutaway moments would include an actual sponge and starfish in place of SpongeBob and Patrick themselves, a cutaway of someone dressed up as a SpongeBob walk-around character you'd see in a theme park, moments of live-action crowds cheering, the use of Nosferatu in one episode, and most notably, a recurring character known as Realistic Fishhead who would report the news.
In other news, local resident SpongeBob SquarePants only has a few hours left to complete his essay, and yet he continues to goof off.
Though even in animated cutaway gags, it also incorporated a lot of detailed, somewhat realistic-looking images of the characters themselves in close-ups to validate certain emotions or feelings, and usually the details would highlight something gross about the character's appearance. Gags included making note of characters' wrinkles, emphasizing a disgusted or horrified expression, or just how unappetizing certain foods were. Now, while a big part of the show, these were only seen occasionally throughout the first season, and it became more of a staple from season 2 on, and based on some clips I've seen here and there, it seems like they're still part of the show's humor to this day. Though the first season didn't use this as much, as the animation style was actually noticeably different compared to how the rest of the show was created. The show initially relied on traditional cell animation, where each frame had to be hand-drawn and painted. It was a painstakingly time-consuming process, though it was a major part of animation for many years, and it goes back to what I was saying earlier, where the writers stated they were influenced by older cartoons. The show wound up switching to digital animation starting in season 2, and the visual quality of the entire show drastically went up. While the first season looked fine and was especially good for its time, it is definitely lower in quality compared to some of the pristine visuals from season 2 on. And going hand in hand with that, I'd also say that, due to the time-consuming process the animators went through, and the limitations it must have placed on them, it does also lead to the first season, in hindsight, not being on the same level as seasons 2 and 3. Now, don't get me wrong. The first season is still very, very good, and I'd gladly sit down to watch the majority of these episodes whenever I need a good laugh. Even the worst episodes of this season, as well as really seasons 2 and 3, are episodes I find to be much, much better than the direction the show ultimately went in after Hillenburg left. But as I especially noted from rewatching every episode recently, I noted how I found most of my least favorite episodes from the original run tend to be from the first season. Now, there are still plenty of highlights that are classics to this day, including Hall Monitor, Ripped Pants, Pizza Delivery, and one of my favorite episodes of all time, Tea at the Tree Dome, among many others.
I need it!
But generally, when I wanted to just throw on a random episode of SpongeBob whenever I was in the mood, I did tend to gravitate more towards season 2 and 3 rather than 1. And while I never found SpongeBob to be a traditional sitcom by any means, I do find the general style of that first season to be a little broader than the other 2 seasons, at least in terms of the situations characters would be placed in. Though it makes sense, especially since we still had to get introduced to a lot of these characters and get accustomed to some of their dynamics. Like, take any episode with SpongeBob's driving teacher, Mrs. Puff. In her first appearance, season 1's boating school for example, we get introduced to one of the reoccurring concepts throughout the whole series, where SpongeBob attempts to pass his driving test, only to cause mass destruction on the road once he actually gets in the boat with Mrs. Puff. And while we see him wreak havoc all throughout this particular episode, and because of this story I do find it to be one of the highlights of the first season, all that destruction is still just within the confines of the school itself, and the plot simply boils down to being a simple road test gone wrong. While it's shown that situations can be taken to the extreme on the show, like the ridiculous way in which SpongeBob had Patrick help him to get through the test,
Testing, 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 testing! Ah!
this situation is nothing compared to the heights we went to in season 2 and 3 episodes with Mrs. Puff, like No Free Rides, where she dresses up as a burglar to steal SpongeBob's boat back after she wrongly gives him his license, or Doing Time, where Mrs. Puff is sent to jail because of SpongeBob, and she loses her mind there while also refusing SpongeBob's help to even break her out. Those 2 episodes had much more drastic repercussions than what we saw in boating school. I mean, we have seen Mrs. Puff wind up in jail in other episodes as like an end gag, but Doing Time is when we saw how much of an extreme it can go to. And that's not to say that the first season didn't have its episodes where it took things to some really extreme heights. Like, I'm not trying to sell it short. This was, after all, the season that gave us SB129, which was one of the earliest instances where the show took a turn for the surreal. But the moments in that first season weren't as consistent compared to seasons 2 and 3. But it's still a great season overall, to be totally clear. But the show really hit its stride for me once season 2 kicked off. At this point, that's when SpongeBob became a cultural phenomenon, which was unlike anything else Nickelodeon ever experienced. While they've had many successful shows prior to this, nothing took off the way this show did in just its first season. But now that it's been firmly established that the formula Hillenburg and the crew implemented worked as well as it did, along with the animation going from cell animation to digital, this now gave them the opportunity to see how far they can push things in terms of the absurd, surreal, and nonsensical. Even if the stories themselves still revolved around something pretty simple and straightforward, the writing definitely experimented with the different ways in which they can take the characters to the extreme. Episodes like Wormy focused on SpongeBob and Patrick taking care of their friend Sandy's caterpillar, who then turns into a butterfly, and we get some extreme close-ups of a live-action butterfly personifying it as a monster, and Bikini Bottom is thrown into chaos. You also had Graveyard Shift, a horror-influenced episode where the Krusty Krab is open for 24 hours, and SpongeBob's neighbor/coworker Squidward realizes a scary story he made up actually may have some truth to it, as everything in the story actually starts to happen. And then there was also another horror-influenced episode, Frankendoodle, where SpongeBob finds a giant pencil from the surface world, and it causes his drawings to come to life, and a mutated drawing of SpongeBob himself begins wreaking havoc in Bikini Bottom. These would be the general types of episodes we'd regularly get in seasons 2 and 3. Along with that, it was stated that in season 2, a number of episodes were based on personal experiences from the crew. Sailor Mouth, for example, when SpongeBob and Patrick first learn about curse words, was based on creative director Derek Dryman's experience when he dropped an F-bomb in front of his mom.
We're gonna tell your mom, Mr. Krabs!
No, please, not my mommy!
Another one, Secret Box, in which SpongeBob obsesses over a box Patrick carries with him everywhere he goes, but whose contents he refuses to share with him, was based on the fact Ryman himself also had a secret box growing up.
The inner machinations of my mind are an enigma.
And that's part of the charm that made SpongeBob so endearing after all these years. While the show frequently went to some absurd levels, it's concepts such as the ones I just mentioned that made SpongeBob so relatable in a way. In many episodes, we see him going through certain things that we may have experienced ourselves, and he does so with the same childlike innocence and naivete that we may have also had growing up, and that makes us able to connect with him. It's just that our paths deviate when he takes his exploration to such extreme lengths that we never would, though that's what makes the show so hilarious. I always appreciated episodes where SpongeBob's trying to navigate his way through a situation and he takes someone's advice, but he'll blow it way out of proportion, mainly in his interactions with Squidward. In Squid on Strike, for example, Squidward tries organizing a labor strike to get better wages at the Krusty Krab, which is a concept entirely new to SpongeBob. And then Squidward manages to negotiate a better deal with their boss, Mr. Krabs, on his own, but unbeknownst to both of them, SpongeBob took Squidward's protest slogans literally, which causes him to destroy the Krusty Krab behind Squidward's back. Or in Artist Unknown, SpongeBob takes an art class taught by Squidward where his talents are just naturally better than his, but he lets Squidward's jealous insults get the better of him, and he gets it in his head that Squidward's way of doing things was actually the right way, or so he thinks. And even when Squidward admits he was wrong and asks SpongeBob to go back to his way of creating art, SpongeBob refuses and will only do things the way Squidward initially said to do them, with the art now just being terrible, and it now causes both him and Squidward to lose out on gaining notoriety for his talents.
Wait, I know this. Oh, wait, I think I got it. Oh, there you go. Yes! Ta-da!
These episodes were always hilarious, for the way in which SpongeBob's sometimes one-track mind would get the better of him, and come back around to affect himself or some of the other characters in the worst ways. And what's nice is that, in many episodes, there was always a little subtle message thrown in there for younger audiences to take away, while all audiences can appreciate the ridiculous jokes. In cases like the ones I mentioned, there's a message in there about not letting people's words and insults get the better of you. And what's great is, while some episodes here and there ended on some really dark and cynical notes, most of them ended on what are meant to be more optimistic notes. Characters may be in much different positions than they were when the episode began, which never carried over into the next episode, but they're still meant to generally reinforce SpongeBob's optimistic worldview in some way, even if there was a sense of irony layered in there. Like in episodes such as the snowball effect or the idiot box. Both end with Squidward essentially losing his mind, and you'll hear him laughing hysterically to himself. But SpongeBob and Patrick are so oblivious to the context, and when they just hear him laughing, they think he's genuinely happy, and the episode will end with their optimistic commentary. Even though the show went into weird and sometimes dark territory, it tries reminding the audience that that's not the worldview it wants you to actually adopt, which is what helps make it so accessible to kids as well. Now, there were several general concepts we typically cycle through for most episodes. There'd be SpongeBob and or Patrick either annoying Squidward or getting into trouble they could have easily avoided. There was SpongeBob getting wrapped up in a get-rich-quick scheme by Mr. Krabs, SpongeBob getting into friendly competition with Sandy or annoying her as well, and SpongeBob trying to stop Mr. Krabs' rival Plankton from stealing the Krusty Krab formula, among a few others.
Brace yourself, SpongeBob. This is my lab. And this is my laboratory.
Not every episode landed neatly into one of these categories, but most did. But I don't think I ever had a particular style of episode I gravitated towards, mainly because I also never really had one favorite character over the other. The best thing about this show was that all of its characters got their moments to shine a number of times throughout the series. Patrick's well-meaning but dim-witted personality made him a great counterpart to SpongeBob in episodes like Hooky, where he kept playing with fishhooks as if they were thrill rides after being warned by Mr. Krabs to stay away, and he keeps tempting SpongeBob to join him. Or there's the Smoking Peanut, where SpongeBob accidentally upsets a giant clam and attempts to hide what he did, only for Patrick's detective work to make him incredibly nervous and paranoid, as Patrick acts like he's onto SpongeBob, only for us to realize he actually has no clue what he's really talking about.
Wow, you guys are good. I'm the last person I would have suspected, but I was looking for me all the time. It's the perfect crime.
Squidward typically acted as the straight man to SpongeBob's antics, but would often shine in moments whenever he buys into whatever it is SpongeBob's enjoying. Like in Club SpongeBob, he keeps trying to ignore Patrick and SpongeBob's adherence to a magic conch shell that gives them advice and commands, only for them to all get lost in the woods, which results in Squidward repeatedly arguing with the conch, even though he says he doesn't believe in anything it says. Sandy's very determined attitude made for a solid rival of SpongeBob's as well, with episodes like Pressure being a big standout, where she and the rest of the sea creatures compete as to who can survive better, her underwater or them above water.
Neptune Preserver.
How long can she stay like that?
I don't know.
Sandy's a girl?
Or there's Karate Choppers, where her and SpongeBob's karate rivalry gets so out of hand, partially because of both of them, that SpongeBob briefly gets fired from the Krusty Krab because of it. Meanwhile, Mr. Krabs himself was an interesting mix. The guy's love of money typically blinded him from caring about anything else, making him very antagonistic at times, like in Clams, where his obsession with getting his $1 million back from a giant clam causes him to threaten leaving himself, SpongeBob, and Squidward out at sea until he gets it back. But then he also has moments where we do see he has a softer side, and his attempts at showing his more humane elements leads to some unpredictable results, like in Krusty Love, where his newfound love of Mrs. Puff causes him to not only get close to bankruptcy because he spent so much on her, but also causes SpongeBob to lose his temper with him, as he keeps changing his mind on how much money he spends and then blames it on SpongeBob.
Then you'll say, we're not talking about this, or this, we're talking about this!
Those are typically our 5 main players, but we did have some fun side characters who were always enjoyable as well, like the aforementioned Mrs. Puff, Plankton, SpongeBob's pet snail Gary, Mr. Krabs' daughter Pearl, the lifeguard Larry the Lobster, the random fish who always shouted "my leg,"
My leg! Chef! My leg!
and so many others. The show is also notable, at least during this period of time, for keeping the voice talented limited to actual voice actors and TV actors. The biggest names in the main cast were Tom Kenny as SpongeBob, who already had a lucrative TV career with Rocko's Modern Life and Mr. Show, and there was also Clancy Brown as Mr. Krabs, who's had a ton of notable movie roles, most famously in The Shawshank Redemption, but he too also had his own history of voice work, most notably as Dr. Cortex in the Crash Bandicoot games. Though it's worth noting Carolyn Lawrence as Sandy went on to voice Cindy in Jimmy Neutron for Nickelodeon as well, which is her second biggest role. But Hillenburg was against bringing on A-list celebrity talent, as he didn't like the idea of stunt casting and only brought certain bigger names on if they specifically fit the story or the role. Some of the only bigger names to appear on the show during his tenure were Ernest Borgnine and Tim Conway as the superheroes Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy, Charles Nelson Riley and Jonathan Rhys Davies as their archenemies the Dirty Bubble and Man Ray, and Brian Doyle Murray in a recurring role as the ghostly Flying Dutchman. And it's refreshing to see a show that didn't rely on stunt voice casting, especially in a post-Aladdin world where that became increasingly the norm. All the voice talent, from the regulars to the guest stars, each fit their roles perfectly, all excelling with their comically exaggerated delivery and superb chemistry with one another. Now, I'd say it's a toss-up between Season 2 and Season 3 as my favorite season. It's close. Season 3 built on the wackiness of Season 2 and continued to take things to bigger extremes. Episodes like Nasty Patty show SpongeBob and Mr. Krabs thinking they murdered a health inspector who simply fell unconscious, and they attempt to cover it up. Meanwhile, the camping episode shows SpongeBob, Patrick, and Squidward all camping outside their houses and have run-ins with a vicious sea bear that would repeatedly attack Squidward, and those remain as some great highlights of the season, and I think many episodes here are even better than Season 2. Though I'd say Season 2 had more consistency to it, because I think Season 3 hit a number of lows as well, which I think partially stemmed from Hillenburg getting ready to call it quits. As I mentioned at the top of this review, Hillenburg wanted to initially end the show after the first movie, which was released once this season wrapped up. While the movie wasn't until 2004, this season premiered in 2002, and Hillenburg halted production soon after the season premiered to focus on the movie. So after a bulk of the episodes were released in early 2002, the remaining 9 were sporadically and sometimes very quietly released between late 2002 all the way through 2004 before the movie's released. Of those remaining episodes, and even a few released right before the hiatus, I'd say most were fine. Like the aforementioned camping episode, Midlife Crustacean, and SpongeBob Meets the Strangler were all great. But this season also had 3 special episodes. One was a full-length 24-minute episode called Ugh, focused on SpongeBob, Patrick, and Squidward's ancestors. And the other 2, one of which was released during the hiatus and the other released beforehand, were your typical 11-minute or so segments that would also be intercut with live-action scenes of Tom Kenny as a character called Patchy the Pirate, who was the president of SpongeBob's fan club, where he'd be doing something that related to the actual episode. And we saw him in The Sponge Who Can Fly, about SpongeBob's attempts at flying, and Party Pooper Pants, where SpongeBob tried to throw a party but winds up getting kicked out of his own house for being a control freak about it. These episodes were okay, I guess. Truthfully, I was really never the biggest fan of the Patchy the Pirate segments. I know some people genuinely love them, but they just try to capture the zaniness of the animated segments in live action form, and they didn't really work for me. And Ugh was a decent concept, expanding upon what we saw in SB129. It just felt like the idea was stretched out a bit too long for me personally. I generally regard all 3 of them as some of the worst of the original run, even lower than some of my least favorite Season 1 episodes. And it just seemed like, with them all being in this one season, the writing was on the wall for Hillenburg to call it quits while he was still ahead. And I really wish Nickelodeon just would have let the show end when he wanted it to. I get why they wanted to continue with it. I mean, it raked in tons of merchandising for what's now literally 2 decades, and it's still their biggest show to this day. The kids who grew up with the original run are now having kids of their own and are introducing them to it through some of these newer episodes, and that's great that that's happening. It's just not the same. I really tried continuing with this after the movie, and at first, it was okay. I know after Hillenburg left, Paul Tibbitt, who was one of the original writers and directors, took over as the showrunner, and if you watch those first 2 episodes after Hillenburg left, it still has some of that same charm that made the first 3 seasons so enjoyable, if not to the same degree. I went on and off with it afterwards, though, because as time went on, newer writers and producers were brought on, and it moved further and further away from its roots. What we ended up getting were character demeanors changing for the worse, the setups feeling more sitcom-like, the humor stopped focusing so much on random one-liners and instead focused on broader slapstick, and there started to be more of the big celebrity cameos that Hillenburg once disapproved of. And while some stuff's funny enough, it's just not the show it once was. And unfortunately, with Hillenburg's passing in 2018, I don't think we'll ever see it fully recreate the magic that it once had. But to end this on a positive note, we still have 3 great seasons, full of laughs and plenty of rewatch value, with such a meaningful impact that will last a lifetime for many. The early episodes of SpongeBob are honestly a must-watch. They still hold up just as well now as they did 20 years ago. Younger audiences will certainly appreciate some of the zany visual gags and absurd scenarios, while adults will find themselves endlessly quoting it for years to come, with its off-kilter, throwaway moments that are sometimes more memorable than the actual episode itself. It's filled with beloved characters, classic setups, plenty of laughs, and a whole lot of heart, and it's a show you won't be able to get enough of. SpongeBob SquarePants Seasons 1 through 3 gets a 9 out of 10. So if I had to break it down, I'd say Season 1's an 8, and both Seasons 2 and 3 are easy 9.5s. There are episodes that are basically flawless to me among all 3 seasons that on their own would be perfect 10s, and then there are some that are just fine. I'll laugh at them, I'll enjoy them, but they're not what I immediately want to watch when I think of SpongeBob. Though, as I said, they're still better than what we got after this. I may potentially do a video recapping my favorite episodes, but we'll see. Though I will soon have a review out of 2004's The SpongeBob SquarePants movie, and in the meantime, let me know your thoughts on SpongeBob SquarePants. What was your favorite episode? What was your least favorite episode? Do you still watch it now? Have you even watched it at all? Let me know in the comments below so we can discuss. Also, if you enjoyed this video, please like it and share it, and for more movie reviews and film and TV discussion, please make sure to hit that subscribe button to stay updated. Thanks for watching everyone, and keep having fun with film and TV.